Yeah, sure, that's fine. Yeah, yeah.
So I'll just introduce for our second panel, we're focusing on how collaboration takes place. So through what technologies, strategies, and frameworks. And in particular, questions like who generates knowledge, what counts as expertise, and how politics of knowledge production enter into more than human collaborations. So we're very fortunate to have Drs. Emma Rowe, Bill Adams, and Mara Miele speaking today based on these themes and questions. So first, we'll hear from Bill Adams from the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge, whose current research explores the role of digital technologies in tracking and framing narratives about non-human lives. So thank you so much. I'm not sure if you have a presentation you wanted to share today, Bill.
Yeah, so it works. That would be good. Oops. Yeah, can you see that?
That looks great. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me. So I found this really interesting to think about collaborations with non-humans, and I thought that what the most useful thing I could do would be to talk about a project that I've been involved with for a little while. I've been very interested in the ways in which new digital technologies offer new opportunities for surveillance, essentially, with non-human animals. And they go well beyond the methods that are possible with conventional ecology and animal behavior studies, ethology. Sensors are both fixed, like things like wildlife cameras, like this one on a trail cam, the picture top right, and there are very small digital sensors which are attached to species here on the bottom right, for example, on a swift with a satellite linked device. Actually, this one's a day length linked device. You attach it and you can trace where the animal goes. And what these devices do is they provide a sort of avalanche of data about the distribution of individual animals in space and time. If they're satellite linked, they can actually track individuals in real time. So you can download on websites where particular migratory birds have got to in their migration from the UK to Africa. And I think this is really interesting for what it does to the science. It's very interesting what it does to the practices of care, the conservation care that may be targeted on these species. But it's also interesting about the relative roles of the animal, or the non-human animal, and the human in terms of generating those data. That's interesting. Okay. So I thought I would share some insights from a project I've been involved in for a number of years about human-elephant conflict in northern Kenya, and the problems that you have when you have people living in a landscape and elephants living in a landscape. Particularly with crop raiding. Elephants love to eat crops for the same reasons that humans love to eat them. They're tasty and plentiful. And you get all kinds of problems of impoverishment of poor farmers, human deaths and injuries, and you get conflict between communities and wildlife managers. So there is a lot of interest in trying to understand these kinds of interactions better. So this research has all taken place in an area called Laikipia in the center of Kenya, which is the place on the map on the bottom left. And the little map at the bottom shows the blue bits of where there are people and the red bits of where there are elephants, and where they overlap, you've got problems. So over the years, I've been involved in a series of projects with different PhD students, led now by Max Graham and Lauren Evans of the organization Space for Giants. And they've done a lot of work using radio collars fixed to elephants, which is a pretty invasive process. You have to mobilize the elephant, fit a radio collar, and then those radio collars can send you hourly locations of that elephant. So you can see Max and his team fitting a collar on the left and the elephant on the right. And when you do that, you can get this kind of readout. This is the track of one particular elephant, which was given the name of Genghis Khan, as marking his sort of destructive nature. And in this case, he's leaving the green area on the map and entering the blue. And as he does that, he moves into an area of smallholder farming. And he's doing this sort of, he moves into the farmland by day and he moves back into the forest or the ranch land nearby at night. So you can track the elephant, you can start to understand what motivates them to move, what gives them the confidence to crop raid, what scares them. And you can start, therefore, to develop various sorts of responses. You can analyze those data like this. Very simply, this is a set of ranches on the right where the elephants are tolerated, and a set of smallholder farms on the left where they're not. And you can start to identify which areas are most vulnerable to elephant action, where the elephants are most at risk from reprisals. And you can develop all kinds of, which Space for Giants have done, develop all kinds of strategies for dealing with that interface. So devices that make a loud noise, or fences which have chili paste on them, which elephants don't like, or burning chili paste briquettes, or bottom right, sort of writing plays about elephants and people and the inefficiency and corruption of the wildlife department and so on. So there's all sorts of interactions that can be triggered, if you like, and directed by this sort of data that come out. Also, you can use devices like Lauren's work with using fixed trail cameras showing elephants breaking through fences, which they do very cleverly and very easily. Even if they're electrified, elephants are clever enough to use their tusks to short the wires out and push the trunks to pull the posts over. And that leads to the identification of particular elephants who get the label of problem elephants. And ultimately, you get the kinds of strategies that you've got bottom right, which is a Kenya Wildlife Service operation to immobilize an elephant and put it on a low loader and take it to a different district where there are fewer farmers. So this kind of strategy leads you to the knowledge about elephants in general, but also about the knowledge about particular elephants. And that leads not just to sort of new activities for farmers, but also new activities for elephants, some of a very invasive and shocking kind. And so in terms of collaboration, I mean, this is clearly the kind of work that is only possible with the elephant as an active participant. And these techniques are amazingly powerful for what they can show. They're very effective in generating new kinds of insights and in triggering new kinds of policy responses. So they're very powerful sort of knowledge, but also very double-edged, in the sense that that the knowledge is available, but of course it's available to the human participants and not to the elephant, and the consequences are very different. So the knowledge doesn't just sort of float in the ether. It's actually acquired by particular organizations with particular sorts of vested interests. And when you have a wildlife service like that of the Kenyan government, which is accused of failing to protect its people, then you get certain kinds of responses. So the knowledge is sort of, if you like, collaborative produced, or I think I prefer co-produced in this instance, because you couldn't produce it without the elephant. But the elephant does not do this voluntarily. You have to find it with a helicopter, shoot it full of drugs to put it to sleep, stick a collar on its back, and then follow its every move. So it's not a voluntary collaboration in that sense. The methods are invasive and or covert. I mean, the camera isn't invasive, but it is covert. And the outcomes and the risks are not shared. So it definitely creates knowledge in a novel way. But in this instance, I find myself thinking it doesn't feel like a truly collaborative action. There's no risk beyond the risk of, I suppose, injuring themselves in the process. There's no risk to the scientists who collect the data. And there isn't, beyond the correct ethical frames for sort of scientific work with animals, obviously really important, there isn't a wider sense in which this kind of work generates a concern about sort of the rights of the individual of the elephant. And in that instance, quite different from some other work that I've been involved in, looking at the implications of surveillance for conservation purposes using camera traps of people. And so there's quite a lot of discussion in conservation circles as to what sorts of rules there ought to be about using camera traps, camera trap images of people. So, for example, if you're a wildlife biologist and you set a camera trap on a wildlife trail to take a picture of an animal, and you actually take a picture of a person, do you give that picture to the game guard so they can identify them and perhaps arrest them for trespassing and so on? So there is a sort of a growing ethical debate about these kinds of technologies for humans, but there isn't, if you like, a debate about them with non-human animals, which suggests to me that this is these sort of technologies lead towards co-produced knowledge, but not really collaborative knowledge in any useful sense. So that's my take on that. Just about 10 minutes. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Bill. That's really interesting to think about these technologies and how they might be related to collaboration, or how that might be a problematic lens in that instance. So we'll open things up for a few minutes of questions. So I'm just gonna see, again, feel free to post in the chat, or if you'd like to turn off your mic and ask a question, feel free to do that. And I'm just gonna look over at the mural and see if we have, oh, we've got one question asking about what the differences are between co-production and collaboration. So I'm not sure if you wanted to, you mentioned that distinction, so if you'd want to speak to that a little bit based on your work.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I mean, I guess that's what I don't have any particularly clever insights about that, but the context for the work that I was involved in, and that certainly conservationists do with these kinds of technologies, or scientists do with these technologies, is not intended to be collaborative or indeed to think about co-production. It's the more efficient generation of more and better data, which of course they would say that they were hoping to use both for the sort of public purpose of creating better understanding, better knowledge, but also to create better outcomes for species. So if there's an ethical frame, it's that good science makes for good policy. And therefore the animal that's enrolled in this kind of activity is assumed to be benefiting, or its species is presumed to be benefiting through those larger scale things. To me, I mean, it therefore they feel very different from the kinds of collaborations that we were hearing about earlier, where there is a genuine risk, a genuine gift and receipt on both sides, because I see the gains as being in one direction. I suspect if one worked, I know that if you studied the people who study elephants, for example, you would find the kinds of potentially life-shaping perceptions of non-human animals, which might suggest that there's a learning the other way, an appreciation the other way. Of course, people who work with elephants think they're going to have those views anyway, or they wouldn't start working with elephants. There's a reason why people study elephants and not house mice. I mean, they're extraordinary animals. So if you whether or not you simply strengthen that by working on them, I don't know. So there is of course I think the effect. I know that people who have been involved in immobilizing and collaring elephants, I mean, it's a huge thing to do. It's a huge, they're very appreciative of the risk that the animal goes under, and I've not been present myself when it's been done, but I can imagine that would be quite one would not walk away from that encounter unchanged, and I think it would be difficult for it ever to become routine like other things are. I don't know if that helps, but it seems to me I suppose I feel that collaboration suggests a benefit in both directions from the exchange. And I think the role of this science is the benefit is very diffuse at best. And the individual elephant is sort of being treated like an individual soldier. You might suffer, but maybe your army will win. That's at best.
Great, thank you so much. There's another question on the mural about covert cameras. I'm not sure if whoever wrote that would like to ask that themselves, or if you'd like me to read it. I'll give you a second here to jump in if you'd like.
That was me, so I feel a bit cheeky to jump in and ask a question right away. But yeah, I'm really interested in kind of the decision-making processes about which methods of collaboration or co-production are used where, and how that impacts the sort of identities of these problem elephants by positioning the camera at the sort of the place where they're bound to be sort of caught doing something wrong, almost like a sort of CCTV, but there's no camera with the elephant. That problem elephant may have been a really central part of their social group, and then he's removed, she's removed, etc. So I just wondered if you thought about the implications for that, and sort of what led the decision to put the GPS tracker on the elephant, but not the camera on the elephant, to see a bit more of that engagement.
Okay, yes. Well, the latter is probably just that no one that I know of has. I don't know whether there is a camera that would be mountable on an elephant's collar, whether that would be seen as a reasonable thing to do. Elephant collars are very massive things because elephants are very big and they're quite hard to fit. So one of the key questions with fitting them is getting them off again. And essentially the only way to get them off is to catch the elephant again and take it off. So there's a lot of concern about those kinds of issues. But no, I think it would be really interesting. And there've been a number of experiments with people putting cameras on wild animals or quasi-wild animals. It's a lot easier, of course, if you've got an animal that's used to being caught and handled. The collars will last for 2 or 3 years. I don't know how long the camera would go and how you would download the data, but you don't want to be trying to catch an elephant sort of twice within a fortnight, I suspect. But the other point is a really good one, which is, I mean, this particular project was looking at the fact that the crop raiding was such a difficulty, such a source of conflict within the area between conservation and poor farmers, and trying to find ways to minimize that. And so they went down the route of trying to understand how elephants moved around the landscape, what made them raid, and how they organized it. They're very clever. They only do it at night, and they know perfectly well when they're likely to be spotted and chased out. So it was about crop raiders, and then it was about building a fence. And when the elephants break the fence, you want to know how they do it and why they do it, and then which ones do it. So it was very much like this. It was, and there was a language of vandalism and sort of rule breaking about it. So yes, it was very much in the spirit of a local council trying to work out, which teenagers are smoking behind the bus stop, rather than genuinely trying to understand the lived experiences of elephants with regard to cameras. The collars, I think, were more interesting, the first insights really into how elephants moved, even when you can't follow them closely. Yeah, no, I mean, I think if one was really interested in trying to understand the kind of lived experiences of elephants using these technologies, you would choose a different sampling strategy. But I think the difficulty someone's mentioned on the wall, the ethics. I mean, the problem is that there is it's a pretty invasive process whenever you want to fit or remove a collar, and so there's a risk to that, and therefore one wouldn't do it lightly, I think.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting questions and decisions to be made there.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And we have a bunch of other questions, but I just want to be a little bit mindful of our other two panelists. So I've got these filed away so that we can come back to a few of these questions in the broader discussion at the end. But thank you so much, Bill, for a really interesting presentation. Emma, I have received your presentation. I think I'm good to go here with it. So we'll give that a try. So next we're going to hear from Emma Rowe, who's Associate Professor in Human Geography at the University of Southampton, and whose research has focused on farmed and laboratory animals, meat, microbes, and most recently viruses. So I'm just going to hopefully share my screen here for your presentation. Can everybody see that? And if you can just tell me when to move your slides forward.
Yeah, let me just get my things right so I can actually see what I'm speaking. Right, okay. First of all, I feel I have to say this, but this has been prepared under homeschooling and nursery closure. So it's actually been, at the moment, if any people in my situation, it's pretty torturous trying to find any time for concentrated thought. So just sharing that with you all, but I'm really delighted to be speaking to you. And I've never really thought that much about the term collaboration. And I think you'll see as I'm talking about the various examples that I've done over the last 20 years where I've been trying to work with non-humans. I guess I haven't been so choosy about which terms I'm using. And I think many of the examples that are coming through today are about working with animals, although we did have the plant example, whereas I'm often working with non-humans who are animals or are the byproducts of animals, meat, or other food products where the consequences of the production of those food products has an effect on plants and animals' lives. So I feel that there's very much the sense that whenever you're talking about a non-human, there's always a big population that is there in the background that you're also trying to find a way to collaborate with if we're going to take seriously some of these issues around the ecological crisis. So anyway, let me go through my examples. So yeah, so I've worked with non-human materialities, sentient and non-sentient, and I guess I strongly believe it's not just about what we study that can bring knowledge and insight to critically engage in our relations to non-human animals and other forms, but also how we research them that is a critical part of this project too. And so that's why I've been always trying to work creatively to think about how we can work better with non-humans. So change slide, please. So I've got these 3 questions that I came up with, which helped me work out about how I want to design research projects across the whole gamut of these different things, like from viruses most recently, microbes, foodstuffs, down to kind of animals. I've never done wild animals, actually. They've always been very domesticated. So how to invite or entertain the non-human into the knowledge generating collaborative participatory research process. How and when do scientific knowledges or other expert knowledges about the non-humans of our interest become useful to learning how to collaborate with them? And thirdly, how do everyday cultures and experiences of non-humans also shape how one can bring human research participants into the collaborative space with non-humans, which is something I'm also kind of realize I'm really interested in. So my research experience goes from kind of embodied food consumption practices, on-farm animal welfare assessments, food animal stock person care practices, the working lives of laboratory animal technicians, emergency food aid centres, looking at men and their diverse protein consumption habits, through to things like the breeding and supply of laboratory mice, the management of antimicrobial resistance, which is another kind of non-human challenge, but in food retail supply chains, hand washing, pathogenic bacteria relations on hospital wards, and I'm about to embark on this project with colleagues to research studying bus user COVID virus relations. But there are various challenges that I've had, that are ongoing about how you kind of do this work, how to design a collaborative research method, how to find a new way of telling the story that can help to generate new forms of knowledge, new forms of ethical relations with these non-humans. So slide, please. So I'm going to begin with this first question, how to invite, entertain the non-human to the knowledge generating collaborative participatory research process. Okay, slide please. And you've basically just got that. I'm trying to give some examples, but I'm not going to talk that much about the examples, but talk more generally around some of these contexts. So my first principle is always to start with studying embodied human interactions with the body or bodies of a non-human. That is fundamentally where I always kind of begin. And to access these, I may carry out ethnographic observations of human, non-human interactions in the field, literally in a field, or maybe on a farm, or in a food bank or research laboratory. But also I realised that there are other contexts where I've had to bring props into a research workshop environment to help to recall practices, memories, feelings, kind of following from what Deleuze says, something forces us to think. And I think if I'm going to find a way to access people's embodied experiences of being in relationship to some of these non-humans, whether it's the food they eat or animals they care for, I need to kind of actually gesture them into a space where they can find a space to talk about them, or ask them to perform different things. So this requires attuning our researcher senses to be newly attentive to how bodies are responding, moving, feeling in relation to the non-human. And in that process, what we might learn of that relation, and to be very attentive to the specific capacities of the non-human at particular junctures with particular people, shaped by particular cultures, or recognizing that some people are always holding some things in tension, having different feelings. So once you've attuned, maybe go back to the previous slide, I think, yeah. Once you've attuned your senses, then there's this practice of learning also about how do you write about accounts where you closely articulate what the non-human body made the human body do, but also made the human body feel, and reverse also, what did the human do to the non-human make the non-human body feel or affect or sense. And and I think that you can play that question out even when they're non-sentient as well, whether it's using soap to kill your virus. Yeah, what was the response of that interaction? So there's a skill in learning how to interpret and convey the role of non-humans as central to the knowledge gathering processes, and especially articulating aspects of that encounter that fall outside a scientific write-up, and to become sensitive to these different multisensory shifts and effective felt responses that take place. And I definitely found that theory, the work of the vital materialist, post-human scholars, has been key to helping me work out how to articulate these different ontologies of human non-human relations. But obviously it is quite different when you're working with two sentient beings like a human and an animal, because there is so much greater complexity going on in that interaction. And I think it's always worth realizing how many more, the greater responsibility we have when we write these accounts up, thinking about what we're including and what we're not including, how we're being marked by the legacy of social norms in human-animal relations, and those animals in very different places, different contexts, and what those norms are, what contemporary politics are, and attitudes to different views and cultures in how we write it up. It's something I'm always asking myself, how am I, when I'm writing about laboratory animals, it's a much more politically sensitive world, and I sometimes feel like I'm being held back by things, invisible forces, to go as far as I might in other ways would like to go. But what is happening there? And I'm working in a collaborative team with other humans as well, and I have to also listen to their concerns as well. So that's something particularly interesting, and it's just as true when working with the meat industry, when you're kind of encouraged to work with stakeholders, and then what is also then happening when you're trying to do collaborative work with the non-humans who are being used in various ways. So, in terms of the methods, interviews, ethnography, focus groups all have a part to play, but there's so much work in how you articulate and interpret what's going on and find a way to write about it. Okay, next slide. So this next question, there's less to say about these next questions. So, how and when do scientific knowledges or other expert knowledges about the non-humans of our interest become useful to learning how to collaborate with them? I think there is always a place for recognising that we as social researchers can never necessarily be the experts, and we must work with others to help develop our relationship with the object of study. Next slide. So, for example, here, this is some of the mapping microbes work, where we were trying to map pathogens, mock pathogens around a hospital ward. And here, the transdisciplinary collaborations that I was able to forge to making this project happen were critical. Because, you know, if you're going to, but it, you know, there I was working with a microbiologist, but I'm also kind of aware of thinking like when you're trying to be a participant observer in the field, like working alongside a stock person when you're doing farm field work, for example, or any of the work that I now do around the meat industry. I've learned so much about farm animal welfare through various years of working in it. I then can help to use that to kind of help to articulate the specificities of the different species that are being turned into meat and how and why there are different economies that are going to start to be generated in different ways about how you would manage antimicrobial resistance. So it's there's lots of different specific knowledges that I think and that you need to kind of bring in and also be aware of that you may need to kind of do some research into to help to find better ways of articulating and collaborating with those non-humans. And then next slide. So, and then lastly, it's how do everyday cultures and experiences of non-humans also shape how one can bring human research participants into these collaborative spaces of non-humans? So next slide. So here I was thinking, I really felt this, next slide, Lauren, when I was doing the man food research, where there's huge emotional taboos about talking with men about animals becoming meat and about then eating them. And so how do you then become aware that you can't easily necessarily even start to collaborate with non-humans with particular humans? You know, you've got to be thinking about what are some of the barriers and cultural challenges of starting to tell them a bit more about the lives of the non-human that you're working in, what role they play in how their lives are lived, and what, you know, and about alternatives and kind of the ecologies that get tied into their experiences. And I think that's something ought to be sensitive to. And then if you move to the next slide, this has also come up again when doing research around thinking about how to engage publics in laboratory animal research. Again, many people don't even want to think about it because they're fear and anxious about what they might be confronted with. So again, how do you do collaborative practices with laboratory mice, but in a space where people can feel safe and work through the experiences of being with laboratory animals and being curious about their lives in a way that is not forcing them into having to confront knowledges they're not ready yet to receive. So here in the mouse exchange, which is our public engagement activity, we're encouraging people to make a felt mouse, and that's a way for them to start to cultivate and explore their relationships of care with a laboratory animal, and to ask questions and to be able to fill in how they would like their mouse to be looked after. And that's basically it. So then the final slide is just to acknowledge my various collaborators over the years. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Emma. That was really interesting. And I'm just going to get back to seeing the mural board here to see if we have any questions that have come up.
I've copied across, there's some really interesting comments that have come through from the end of Bill's talk as well. So I've copied all of them onto the mural, lovely, ready for the wider discussion, just so you know.
I'm just going to get situated here. Jenny, is there anything from Emma's talk that you can point out just to get us started?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, there's one in process right now. Up at the top. Can you see it?
Okay. Okay, about rodents, researchers and rodents. Would anyone who wrote this like to read it or ask the question, or would you like me to? All right, sorry, I'm just trying to zoom in here a bit more. So there's a comment or questions saying that male researchers stress out rodents. Rats and mice show increased stress levels when handled by men rather than women, and potentially skewing study results. Male but not female experimenters induce intense stress in rodents that can dampen responses, according to a paper published in Nature Methods. And such reactions affect the rodent's behavior and potentially confound the results of animal studies. So the authors discovered this surprising gender disparity while investigating whether the presence of experimenters affects rodent pain studies. And anecdotal reports have suggested that rodents show a diminished pain response when a handler remains in the room. Would this count as selective collaboration?
I think it's beautiful to hear that story. Well, yeah, I think we have to recognize that people, different non-humans are going to form particular relationships. We know that that relationship happens across lots of different animals, so why not for these rodents too? I mean, there's a lot of attempt to try and standardize the human by everybody wearing the same gloves, wearing the same uniform, but obviously there are other kind of smells that seem to escape.
In fact, Emma, if I may just add to my comment there, I think people are now increasingly recognizing that rats, laboratory animals, recognize the handlers by face, visually, and hence it may be quite specific, and hence it would be fascinating to see whether they respond physiologically or behaviorally more appropriately when their favorite handlers are working with them.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously with primates, then that's, I think, kind of well accepted that, for example, the handler that's been with them through their life is probably the one that will euthanize them, which is particularly painful for that animal carer. I think it's interesting about how much that acceptance has gone down to kind of the level of rodents.
And it's been said for fish as well, by the way. Apparently fish recognize the faces of their researchers.
Mm.
Great, thanks. I'm just keeping an eye to see if any other questions are coming up in the chat or the mural. In the meantime, sorry, this isn't a fully formed question, but I was interested in the beginning or earlier section of your talk. You mentioned about the importance of embodied interactions and new ways of telling this story or the stories of within our research. And part of our interest has been in this question of like storying as a collaborative process. So I'm wondering how that might have been a thread that you've picked up throughout your research, or if you could speak at all to methods and storying.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm always aware that when I'm tasked with having to write up research, that I have to, the work I need to do to try and push myself to restructure sentences to try and center the non-humans' experience or how they were encountered with, rather than just to pacify them in the way in which you kind of approach a write-up. I think even so much of our social science writing is still doing that a lot of the time, and it isn't really attending to how the non-human affords different responses from us as studying who are in relationship to non-humans. And I guess in terms of how we do, I mean, I've been, we've experimented a bit more with doing kind of some more visual video work, pseudo microbes around a hospital ward, because actually there's so much, and there is a lot of discussion about hand washing, but there's very little work that actually looks about how it can trace and how mobile pathogens can be in a ward environment. So finding a way to start to communicate around that. So it's not always, I think, necessarily you need to put it into words, but also you can use a lot of kind of images as well, or different kind of performances to bring it alive in other ways to put your research data out there.
Great, thank you so much. And I think just keeping an eye on the time, that maybe we'll move on to our final panelist for today. And if there's any further questions for Emma about her presentation, feel free to post in the mural and we'll have a bit of time for an open discussion at the end. So thank you again, Emma, that was really interesting. So our final panelist this morning or today is Mara Miele from the School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff University, whose research focuses on human, non-human animal encounters and interfaces, including in the context of farmed animals and welfare. So Mara, I'm not sure if you're good to share your screen, if you've got a presentation.
Okay. Sorry, doesn't seem to.
Yeah, we can see that now.
Oh, but
You
see my desktop?
We see a full desktop.
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
I was hoping you would just see the presentations, but okay. Let me see if I can. Okay. Can you see the presentation now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm delighted to be here today. I think, it's been incredibly interesting to listen to all the presentations so far. And what I'm going to, well, first of all, I'm going to say that I've interpreted, the theme of today as a more than human collaboration, maybe slightly differently than previous speakers. That might be a good thing. The way in which I've interpreted is that, especially because I was invited to talk about methods, was about, how do we apprehend, how do we try to get to understand the experience of the non-humans in practices of collaboration. And therefore, I decided to present some of the insights, some of the current research that I'm doing. Is a collaborative research funded by the Leverhulme Trust. The title of the research is here, Interspecies, Connectedness, Training Culture and the Emergence of New Forms of Human-Animal Interaction. Is the research that is done at Cardiff, is myself and Harriet Smith, which I think is in the audience, and I hope she can participate in some of the conversation about what we've done. And Nikki Charles at Warwick University with Rebecca Fox, as well as Françoise Wemmenfelder as Rook in Edinburgh. And Françoise is an animal scientist, and I've known her for a long time, and we first met when we started to collaborate about 15 years ago actually, on the welfare quality project, and she was developing the qualitative assessment behavior as an innovative animal welfare approach to assess the mood or the welfare states of animals, just looking at behavior. And it was highly contested within animal welfare science, but became much more adapted. And so we try to design this research looking at different forms, different ways of training dogs, combining insights from social sciences, human geography, animal geographies, sociology, STS, as well as animal science. And so we've been experimenting with a number of different methods, and I'm going to tell you something about, you know, what we've done and where we're going now, because the project is ongoing. We started in 2018. We were supposed to finish in December, but because of COVID, obviously, we had some difficulties. So we've been able to get an extension of the project, and so we will carry on in this year. So basically, just to start talking about dog training cultures and dog training practices. Now, it is widely acknowledged in the literature that there has been a kind of sea change in the way in which dog training practices have evolved. And so from kind of more male-dominated kind of work based on correction and punishment, it has become, in the last 20 years, a largely female profession based upon completely different methods and approaches. The dominant one is positive reinforcement. And so if you look at the literature, most likely in recent time, dog training is seen as a way of civilizing canine to make them suitable to live in a human society. And there has been, in recent times, also very influential work by Donna Haraway and others, that they look at dog training as a possibility to foster much better human-animal relationship. And they hold the possibility of human-animal relationship to flourish and being mutually beneficial. Enabling the animals, for example, to live in a human-dominated world without restraints or punishment, and to experience, closeness and companionship in a kind of mutually rewarded way. And so this alternative notion of dog-centered training practices had not been welcomed by, or they're not being interpreted by everybody as, innocence or some, influential work, for example, by Justina Rodarczyk recently, pointed out how, these positive reinforcement methods, they just exploit some natural tendencies or instincts of dogs, and they make them, the perfect neoliberal subject, that they embrace the work that they've been given and they do it for the reward. We took, actually, we started from the assumption of looking at the process of working with dogs, training dogs for working with dogs as a possibility to become with, as a sort of an open questions, whether or not the practices of work would offer the opportunity and possibility to mutual flourishing. And so we've been looking at different practices, our case studies, looking at police dog training, gun dog training, guide dogs, therapy dogs, and companion dogs. And what I'm going to present today is some insights from our first case studies, the police dogs. And also, I'll talk about the methods that we use and how we, try to adapt our methods to leveling the gaze and to make possible for the non-human participants in our research, to take a kind of equal share of attention than in others. Our attempt was actually to develop methods for what is highly cited or highly, searched for multi-species ethnographies. So we've been sharing the sort of concerns from, the original formulation of these concepts and try to adopt methods that would enable us to have a kind of symmetrical view of practices, incorporating, the non-human as equal participants and paying attention to non-human agency and non-human involvement in these practices. obviously that brought up some significant questions about how to do it and what sort of methods we could use to level the gaze. You know, we were dealing with animals. We were, you know, becoming very much aware that obviously we were dealing with, you know, beings that they had a completely different sensoriums of us. So, you know, their whole life is much more centered upon the sense of smell. Their vision is not made in color, and their perspectives is obviously very different from ours. You know, they look from, you know, they look at us or whoever they are working with from below, while humans, they tend to look at dogs that they work with from above. And while this one might seem a kind of, you know, very simple observation, it has implication from the way in which you look at the world and what you pay attention to. And so in order to be attentive, you know, to these differences and trying, you know, to make really an effort of leveling the gaze, we combine a number of methods, from the more traditional observation in situ, shadowing methods from STS, but we use lots of photo diaries, for example, of every visit that we paid to to the sites and the case study that we were doing. The videos, we use videos primarily for developing materials for the QBA. So we had the necessity to create short video clips of training events. The video clips had to be no longer than 1 minute in order to be used for the qualitative assessment behavior. I can say more about what it is and how it's done later. But also we use obviously more traditional methods. You know, we use going along interviews and conversation with trainers, the supervisors, police officers, handlers, carers, and everybody involved in the, you know, in the practice that we were exploring. And forgive me, I've been very cheeky here, and I included a photo from Harriet. Hope she's not upset, because she was taking most of the videos and I was taking most of the photos during the during our research. So we've been looking at different cases of police dogs, but we concentrated particularly in one. The training for police dogs lasts 12 weeks. And so we repeated visits at different times to see how the partnership was working and how, you know, the construction of the bond between the officer and the dogs was constructed through training, because the training is not only for the dogs, the training is actually an opportunity to build a bond between the officers that will work with the dog and the dog itself. And our interest moved very quickly to understand how this bond was constructed and what was the agency of the dog in constructing this bond, what was made of, you know, their ways. And we discussed it actually, some of these results in a paper that is now in early viewing transaction. I put the reference in here if you want to hear the full stories. What I'm doing now, I'll show you some example of the materials that we collected. So these are examples from the photos, the stills that we had. And this is really early stage. This is the beginning of the week, second week. And they were doing some agility training. And this is a novice couple, a novice police officer, which is just matched with a dog. The dog actually is more experienced, but the previous officers that she's been working with, the previous actually didn't work, so she was reassigned. And as you can see, you know, from these images, well, the dog is not performing the task correctly, is not actually jumping, is going around. Problem is not with the dog, the problem is with the officer, that she was not actually throwing the ball in the right way, directing the dogs. So the instructor is actually showing how, you know, the gesture should be repeated. And once the gesture is done correctly, you can see that the dog is actually performing the task correctly. And then it is, oh, let me go back. I can show you. This is There's a video clip that is showing, you know, how the dog is rewarded. I'm afraid he's not playing well. Well, I'll stop it. He's not, we can't hear. But the point is that once the dog performed the task correctly, he's actually prized with, you know, lots of, you know, nice words in high pitch voice, hugs and touches and smiles and toys. And this is repeated. And this is repeated all the time. Anyway, I'll stop because these videos don't seem to work correctly. And so it's based on, and the dogs, they get rewarded with toys and all these other kind of technologies. We call that technologies for bonding. And then after they perform a task, you know, they sit in their kennel in the car and they wait for the other dogs to perform their own task as well. And through the 12 weeks of training, they learn how to play together. They learn how to perform those tasks, but they also learn the officers. They actually learn how the dogs like to be rewarded, what actually works, what doesn't work, whether or not the dogs enjoy that kind of work. Because if they don't enjoy playing, you know, obviously they're not going to do it. And actually, we've been looking at those ways of learning how to work together and how to develop a relationship and how to build a bond as a space in which we could see examples of the dog willingness to engage with those activities. And we call that collaboration, and we call that you know, sharing and creating a bond. I'll stop here. Obviously, we couldn't do that work. We couldn't spend days looking at dog training practices. And so now we move to more remote methods, and we've been using GoPro. And I'll show you a little bit of how this is offering us an opportunity to see things quite literally from the perspective of the dogs. This is not a training practice. This is my own dog. And actually is also hired dog. And we are actually experimenting how to use the GoPro and how the dogs see the world. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That's really interesting research. And I'm just taking a look at our mural board here. I see Jenny's posted a question. Do you want to start us off, Jenny?
Sure, yeah, I can do again. Yeah, I guess my question specifically for Mara was about sort of the professionalization of dog training and how this impacts what we might conceive as collaboration. I'm thinking very much about sort of the setting that you're in and the very structured, institutionalized approach, particularly of things like dog training, which is in sharp contrast to sort of the dog training I've encountered or been a part of with maybe sheepdogs learning on the farm or on the fell, which is very different to sort of sheepdog trial training, which again is quite institutionalized, and also things a little bit more contentious, I'm sure, but things like gun dog training and how that's done by an individual and takes place within the landscape, within the setting the dog lives as well as works. So how do you think this impacts collaboration, and what kind of dialogues change in these two settings with like the much stricter expectations and rules versus the much more personal and intimate, potentially informal settings?
Yeah, it's a very good questions. And then, well, you know, we've been surprised in many ways to see, you know, to see the results of, you know, looking at different training practices. One thing is quite common everywhere, for example, for police dog training, even if you expect obviously the dogs to become incredibly proficient, you know, they work will be all about protecting the officer and responding at command, attack and responding at command. The police officer, they think that their dog, they live really a good life. They are active all the time. They, you know, they take their job very seriously, but for them, it's just performing something that they have a drive for, because he's enabling them to do what they really like to do. And they spend the time with the police officer virtually 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So it is professionalized. Obviously, there is a high level of investment in terms of, you know, developing standards. You might be surprised that there is no agreed standards. For example, for there is a police standard manual, but it's not. There is nothing in the legislation or law that says how you should train a dog. There is nothing about how you should protect the welfare of dogs, not even in, you know, other sort of practices. So it's really a kind of becoming much more professionalized, but not very much regulated. Not really for therapy dogs, or absolutely nothing for guard dogs or companion dogs. So it's interesting forms of, you know, becoming incredibly more popular, a growing number of organizations that are offering training services, but very little regulation about it.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
Great, thanks so much. So just with an eye to time, we've only got about 10 minutes left in our scheduled program. So I just wanted to open things up for any remaining questions or comments for any of our three panelists in this last discussion, and especially, or if any of the panelists want to respond to one another and things that have come up. We've got a few minutes left to do that. I know some of the questions from earlier in the discussion we didn't have time for, so if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask something they've posted, please feel free to do so now. Or I might prompt, I know there was a question earlier on the mural in terms of Bill's presentation in particular. There's a question from Adam. Did you want to ask your question now, Adam?
Hi, yeah, sorry. My question was, thanks to all the presenters there for brilliant, engaging presentations. I really enjoyed it. But this question I wrote before, just specifically to Bill. But I guess others can think about it as well, in the fact that there was different levels of technological engagement there. But I was interested, Bill, in to what extent you felt that the elephants themselves were lost by the process of digitization, because they seemed to become separate actors that moved in different circles, particularly as they became influential in conservation management circles. And yeah, I was wondering whether this made the digital elephant, I guess, more powerful than the elephant itself, and what are the kind of epistemological implications of that, I guess.
Well, okay, that's really interesting. So I think the digital elephant that is the channel for the most power is the picture of the elephant, the cute elephant, the orphan elephant, the dead elephant, the whatever, you know, that sort of that use of imagery and the sharing of that imagery digitally has been talked about quite a bit. I think there is a sense, the thing that's interesting about these technologies to me is that they pull an individual out of a crowd when you can't necessarily see them, and they give that identity of the individual to people who couldn't see them. So I'm sure I would not have the skills to follow an elephant for 24 hours, although that's perfectly possible if you have someone with good field skills and great physical fortitude. but I could get the data from MoveBank, an international database, and I can analyze it. So it makes that, it individualizes one elephant out of the generality of elephants, and it then makes that available. And so in a sense, I think that elephant is more influential. I mean, it's what it does is seen to somehow stand for other elephants. So it makes a story of it, it puts itself in a position to have a story made about it. But of course, the elephant itself doesn't have any power. The story is powerful, and the person who articulates the story is empowered by it. The elephant itself perhaps doesn't have any of that. Doesn't have any of that power. Indeed, drawing attention to yourself if you're an elephant is a pretty bad idea. The best thing is to be invisible, getting on with your elephant life, preferably without being collared or chased or observed or doing anything that's unpopular to your bipedal residents. So yeah, really interesting question. I think it is, to me, it's this question, the pulling out of the individual, which this technology does, is what's really game-changing. And I don't think I've really thought through what that means. I mean, what does it mean when you've got 1 million birds flying from Northern Europe to Africa every winter, that you can name one and you can put it on a website, and school children can follow it in their class every day? I mean, that's an amazing thing to do, and from it flow all kinds of concerns and potentialities and so on. So yeah, good question, to which I don't know the answer.
Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for that. And I think there's been a couple of other questions or comments about technology as well. Alice has a question about how technology changes our understandings of collaboration or co-production. So I was wondering if Alice, you want to speak to that at all, or if any of our three panelists want to respond to this idea of technology in collaboration.
Thanks, Lauren. It's just a very broad question, so I will leave it for others to mull over. Thanks.
Well, I guess I recognize how I've been using technology in various very simple technologies, like using UV gels, to help to find a way to collaborate with pathogens that are too dangerous for us to ever actually touch or be within in a space. Yeah, so I think there's some interesting, and I guess that's where we also kind of would think about some of the other species, or who we just actually, it wouldn't be in their advantage if we were too close to them. So that's why we use technology as another mediating device. So in a whole range of different spheres, I think technology is actually so prescient to how we might think about doing some of this collaborative work.
Yeah, I also agree that technologies, they help you to think differently, and they help you to move away from the dominant approach that you have. So, for example, I realized that having to, when we started to use cameras and when we started to use the GoPro, we started to reflect more upon the perspective of the dog. So for dogs, for example, is the whole body of the person that counts the most. That's what they see. They don't see the face. But we humans, we always refer to the face, even if the face is not the most significant place, let's say, for expressing emotions or other states. And technology may help you to engage with the different sensorium and the different perspective. So also the soundscapes, the GoPro cameras as well, they capture the noise that is actually heard by the dogs in our case, that we wouldn't be able, if we were just observing at distance, or if we just are filming or taking photos from this. So it's in a way, I found it productive in a sense, from making myself and others reflect more on how we look at things from our own very human sensorium and perspectives, and and is more difficult to disentangle our view if you don't really use something that helps you to take away your eyes from, you know, your subject.
Great, thank you so much for those thoughts. I just am seeing that we only have about a minute left, so I just want to thank everyone so much. Thank you to our speakers, our panelists today, for some really thought-provoking ideas from your own research around collaboration. And thank you so much for everyone else for being here and for sharing your thoughts and comments and questions. So we're meeting again next Wednesday at the same time for our second panel, or our third panel rather, and our keynote address. In the meantime, I think our three organizers, Johnny and Jenny and myself, will take a look through the chat, take a look at the mural, and anything that we didn't have time to discuss today, we're gonna put in that mural box for the final discussion. But also feel free, if I guess this mural is a live document, so if you think of things over the next week that you'd like to bring up around anything that's come up today, or your own thoughts or your own work, feel free to tuck it in there, and we should have a good amount of time in a final discussion to get back to some of these ideas. So yeah, thank you all so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you next week.